Sarah. It is Thursday, June 26th. I'm glad you had a good trip. It looks super fun, and I'm a little bit jealous that you got to go fun places. I have been enjoying my break, my summer break between quarters. You know, been doing crafts and taking trips to immediate care, you know, urgent care. What do you call it here? Instacare. It's called Instacare here. Because, you know, I sliced my thumb with a rotary cutter, no big deal, except it ended up being kind of a big deal, but then not a big deal. I feel really bad, actually, because I call my dad, you know, with questions about medical advice, and so I sliced my finger, and it just felt like a paper cut. Like, it didn't really hurt that bad or anything, so I just washed it off and wrapped a band-aid around it, and I kept working on my quilts. And then I bent my thumb and like blood oozed out from the band-aid. I'm like, that's a lot of blood. So I call my dad and I'm like, hey Dad, how long can something bleed before you should be worried about it? And he's like, what did you do? And I was like, I just cut my thumb on a rotary cutter and it's still bleeding. And he's like, how long has it been bleeding? And I'm like, I don't know, a couple minutes. And he's like, well, you know, if it takes longer than like 5 or 10 minutes, then you can maybe be worried. And then, so I'm on the phone with him, and at this point I bent my thumb to look at it, because he's like talking about stitches and stuff, and I'm like, I don't think it's that deep. So of course, me being me, I bend my thumb to look at it to see how deep it is, and blood squirts me in the face, which is super, super gross, and I didn't know that, like, thumb wounds could squirt like an artery. Gross. Anyway, so I go into the bathroom and I'm like washing my hand off and stuff, and I'm talking to my dad, and I'm like leaning on the sink, and I'm like, Dad, I feel kind of lightheaded. Though, side note, last time I got my blood drawn, they took 3 vials and I passed out, because I don't seem to do very well with like blood or needles, particularly when it's my own blood. And you know, in my head I'm like, it's not a big deal, but my body has like a visceral reaction and it's really obnoxious. So I'm like leaning on the sink and I'm like, Dad, I'm really lightheaded. And he's like, that's not a good sign, like they might have to stitch that, like if it's still bleeding. And I'm like, well, it's on my knuckle, I keep opening it, which might be why it's still bleeding. And so he's talking about stitches and stuff again, and so I'm thinking about needles, and I'm bleeding, and I'm just like, oh, I feel really sick. And he's like, maybe you should sit down. And then next thing I know, I'm on the floor, and my dad is like, Katelyn? And I'm like, sorry? What were we? Oh! I had passed out on the phone with my dad, and fallen into the shower curtain and woke up in the bathtub, and he was kind of freaking out. I feel really bad about calling my dad because, you know, that's a thing that probably stresses him out. And so then he was like, you need to go in. And I'm like, Dad, I don't even think it's that bad. I think it'll be okay. And he's like, Katelyn, go in. And I was like, okay, well, I don't even know where the nearest emergency care place is. I'm not going to the emergency room for this. It's not that bad. So then I called, you know, Jessica and Katelyn, and was like, hey, do you know where the nearest emergency care is? And they were like, do you need a ride? I'm like, yeah, maybe. So they took me in, and Instacare is really inappropriately named because the wait was like an hour, and by the time they saw me, like, I wasn't even bleeding anymore. But they did make me get a tetanus shot, which is obnoxious. I'm still sore. Yeah, so then they didn't even stitch it up. They just glued it back together and put a splint on it and were like, you're good to go. I'm like, sweet. So yeah, exciting over here. Keep being authentically awesome.